Hello there, virtual space hero community, and welcome again to our autumn live sessions here on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook, the platforms we are streaming to. We are continuing our journey to dive deep into topics about remote work and hybrid work. We have been interviewing for the past 2.5 years thought leaders from across the globe, and we are more than happy that Mike Swigunski found the time to join us. Mike is one of the thought leaders and pioneers when it comes to make your own career remotely, and he will tell us today how you can do that with his global career book. But also we will talk about what do we need to consider when we in our organizations hire remotely. And without further ado, I am welcoming Mike to the virtual space here at LinkedIn live stage. Hi there, Mike.
Hey, Barbara, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to talking about the remote work realm and everything in between.
Thank you so much for taking the time. Mike, you yourself has been a dedicated global nomad since 2011. That's what I read, right?
Yeah, I just celebrated visiting my 100th country this year. So I've been working and traveling for more than a decade now.
Wow, wow, wow. And let us know, how did that all start, Mike?
Yeah, so it all started initially with a study abroad program. So I studied in Bergamo, Italy. And essentially after that, I was organizing some group sessions for Italian students, American students. And some of the organizers kind of noticed that, and they suggested that I apply to be a student manager the next year. And so I applied to be a student manager, and I was able to be accepted for the Prague Study Abroad program. And essentially, this program was really struggling. They only had 7 students the year before. And they're like, if you don't get 15 students on board, we're not going to have a program anymore. So we grew the program to 35 students that next year, the max it could take. And then essentially just kept growing this Prague Study Abroad program. And the way it was structured was it was essentially a 2-year sort of job or position at the University of Missouri. So I was teaching a course through the university, taking students over to Prague in the summers, working with the faculty there as well. And it was my senior year of college, and I was at this crossroads. I was interviewing for corporate jobs, but then I had a group of study abroad students that I was planning to take overseas. So I decided to do that. I booked a one-way flight. And when I got there, I just started looking for jobs with my network and asked the university if they had any openings. And because I had 2 years of teaching experience, I had built a strong relationship with them. I grew their study abroad program, so they were very happy. And they hired me to teach financial economics, which was my background. So that was my first job out of college, was teaching students at a university who were actually, a lot of times they were actually older than me. So it was a really fascinating sort of light bulb moment where I was like, okay, I can just move abroad. I can find a job and I can still travel and do something that I absolutely love. So it was kind of like this light bulb moment. I realized the academia career path wasn't what I really wanted. So after a year of doing that, I transitioned to working for tech companies in sales and marketing. And that slowly transitioned into working remotely. And that was truly, it was like, oh, I thought you had to be a developer to work remotely. But eventually, I found that wasn't true. And like I could utilize sales and marketing to work from my laptop. And that's kind of the condensed version. My book kind of condenses the 10 years. It's a lot more in depth on all of that. But yeah, if you're wanting to see kind of the more in-depth step-by-step version, my book essentially follows my path of working and traveling over the past decade.
And it's fantastic because, Mike, your book is, and you also were featured in Forbes, CNBC, Entrepreneur, New York Post. So you got an amazing sort of feedback also on the things that you were publishing and talking about even before Corona, right? Even before the pandemic. So when you look into organizations, so maybe let's switch a little bit our discussion and look at it from an organizational point of view. When organizations hire for remote workers, what are they or what should they be looking for in terms of skill set?
Yeah, so this is I feel like I have a very unique kind of position on this because I was a remote employee and then I worked for a tech startup, and it was actually one of the fastest growing companies in the US, we grew it from 4 remote workers to more than 100 remote workers. So it was a remote first company. And I've seen kind of the insights of the hiring process, what to look for. And I've also myself, been a remote employee. So I really kind of have a grasp on what to do in this space, just to give your audience some reassurance there that I've kind of been on both sides of the table. And I have my own remote team now. So as far as your question, what are the essential skills? Is that what you're wondering?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I would say remote workers, at the end of the day, there's not going to be somebody really micromanaging you, looking at over your shoulder in the office. So I would say the first skill you need to have is to be very independent and self-motivated. And that might sound easy, but there's got to be some ways you can project that and portray that on your resume, on your LinkedIn. And so you really have to get creative. And a lot of times remote companies are going to love that creativity if you're able to showcase that, one, you worked remotely, or two, you were able to do something on your own to kind of be ambitious and kind of take that sort of that leap on your own to really run with something. And if you can do it in the past, if you could do it for another company, then there's a good chance you can do it for the future company. So I would say that's kind of the most important skills. There's this sort of misinformation that you need to be super tech savvy, a developer, a coder. There's a lot of opportunities for customer service, for sales, for marketing. So if you have any of those skills, that's going to translate very well to the remote workforce.
Thanks for sharing these points. So I was also involved last year in a project where I was in charge of developing sort of the leadership development program for a multinational, and I was working together with the HR department, and it was very interesting to see it's also a remote first company, and they were particularly in the hiring process figuring out, or it was under a huge discussion on how to figure out whether the remote workers have good writing skills. And of course, considering how important asynchronous communication can be and is when we are working remotely or in remote first companies, that was really an interesting discussion. What have you seen there in terms of writing skills and how that was or is assessed or viewed by organizations?
Yeah, the communication skills really are important. There's definitely going to be people who are better verbal communicators, better written communicators. I think, most jobs you just kind of have to kind of suss that out. I think a lot of times you can figure out just by your communication. Maybe you can kind of put some sort of thing into the application process. I've seen a lot of remote teams. They ask for a short clip. Maybe you could also add in on that, like a writing sample or a situation where, hey, the communication's tough. Like, what are some of your ways you can really communicate well with people? And the best way that I found is a lot of times you're on Slack and you're just not getting it. Like the two options that I love is like, if there's just some miscommunication, hey, do you have 5 minutes to hop on a call? I feel like that'll be a lot easier. And then just create a Zoom link, invite them to that. I know a lot of times, people just want to schedule a meeting for like 5 days later, but sometimes it's a little more urgent. The second thing I love is creating Loom videos where it's going to share your screen, you're just going to share your video, and you can also add in text. So it's kind of utilizing every area of communication. And you don't have to set up a call. You don't have to set up a meeting. You can record a Loom video of your laptop and of you, and you can highlight what the issue is, what's going on. And I found that to be very impactful for communication, because you run into these things where the text just isn't doing it. So a lot of times it's better if you're not a good text communicator to really get on video or to make a Loom video. But in almost all cases, it's just a lot easier to communicate that way.
Those are very great points. Thanks. And when we talk now about how to find those remote workers, so we do know the skills that we are looking for. We talked with our leadership crew, for example, and then how do we find them? I do know that nowadays we see in the studies that 70 to 80% of employees would even leave their companies if there are no remote possibilities, but it's rather going towards the hybrid. So remote, 100% remote workers, how do you find them? What platforms would you suggest looking at?
Yeah, so there's a few platforms that I love. Obviously, LinkedIn is a great one. If you're looking for remote workers, that's kind of a great place to start. And then just say this is like a fully remote or whatever restrictions you have. Make sure you're very transparent about that when you're hiring. It just wastes everyone's time if you're like not clear that it's like, oh, you have to be in like Eastern time. If that's not super clear. So definitely add transparency in that. The other platforms that I love, like I have globalcareer.io. That's my own job site. We're mostly non-technical remote jobs. Dynamite Jobs is another great platform. We work remotely as well. All of these, like, there's 4 or 5 like really big remote work platforms where they're ideally or primarily hiring remote only positions where anybody in the world can essentially work for this. Some of them are going to be only US based, but usually there's a lot more flexibility. So I would start there. The problem with a lot of these big websites like Monster is you have like remote jobs kind of like mixed in with non-remote jobs. So it just becomes a little bit harder. A lot of them are kind of making some solutions for that, like Indeed and stuff. So there's a lot of good options out there. I would say you need to be posting your position on at least 5 or 6 different platforms to really get some good traction. And then also promote to your own audience. That's always a great way. If you have an audience, some of the best people who follow you are going to come from your own network and stuff. Lastly, you can always refer your employees, like have an incentive for them to get somebody. If they hire somebody they refer, they get $1,000, gift card or something.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. And you already mentioned a few points. So we're talking now about the platforms, but when we have that job post, you said you need to be very transparent. So for example, you mentioned the time zones that you need to make clear where you need to be available, during which you need to be available. What other aspects would you say are among the most important 3 ones that should definitely be included in such a job ad on one of those platforms?
Yeah, so I would say the kind of the perks of the remote job, like what are all the details, what are all the requirements? Obviously, there's going to need to be like what is the job, and what are they going to be doing? What's the day-to-day task? I do see a lot of remote job positions that just read like an old textbook and they're super boring. I was like, who's applying for these? Like, it just seems so overly complicated and corporate. So try to, like, I don't know, put your thought into who you want to hire. And, if it's somebody who needs to be very, technical writer or a literature writer or something, then yeah, maybe that's the right way to create that post. But I would say try to figure out who your audience is first and then position the post that way. I really think that we need to add more transparency into the hiring process. So I love when companies are adding a salary range, that just prevents it wastes so many people's time. Like, years back when I was interviewing for jobs, it was just such a time suck because I would apply for, a CMO position that I assume is going to be over 6 figures because with a VC backed company, they have like a huge headcount. And, you go through the hiring process, like, oh, you're so far off on the range that I had in mind that it's just not worth it. And we're just wasting both people's time. So I think having a range is also going to be important. And then having like any perks, or you're going to have some, healthcare perks, or you're going to have some, remote working stipends. What's the vacation policy? Just try to add all that stuff in because it's becoming competitive and you want to attract the top talent, right? So you want to be able to look at what your competitors are hiring and then kind of one up that. And you'll attract better talent by doing these kind of small things.
Do you think that now with this global outreach in terms of recruitment and application process, do you believe that platforms such as Glassdoor are receiving a bigger importance in order to be informed about who am I applying for?
Yeah, I definitely think it's becoming more important, but all this stuff is you got to take it with a little grain of salt because there's going to be some corporations that just have higher turnover and they're going to have you got to really take into context because on Glassdoor, there's going to be a lot more incentive for somebody to leave a bad review. But I do think it's a great platform. I agree that there should be more transparency kind of in the industry. So I think it's very important to do your research. For me, I go in with it like when I was applying for jobs before I was, an entrepreneur, I kind of went in with the mindset like are these people a good fit for me, not the other way around. So I would do a lot of research. I would check out the LinkedIn of, the employees. I would even reach out to employees there to see if they're, are you happy with the job? Like people that aren't in the hiring process, because again, you might be potentially leaving a pretty good job to go to another unknown job. So you need to make sure you're performing some due diligence and research to make sure that it's a good fit.
Absolutely. And if we move now a step further in the hiring process, and we look at the recruiting process and the recruiting experience. So are there any particular hiring tools that you would recommend, particularly when we look at remote workers? And then beyond that, how should the interview look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say, like, depending on how many applicants you're expecting to get, how big your company is, do you have a dedicated HR person? Because if you're just, you're looking to hire one person and it's employee number 3, you probably don't need an applicant tracking system. You can probably just make like a free Google form and just like put it into a spreadsheet, set up interviews that way, because you're not going to get thousands and thousands of people that way. As far as like, if you have a bigger company and like you're really have an HR person who's going to be spending some time, then I would say, yeah, invest in some sort of applicant tracking system that's going to keep everything organized. If you're getting lots of, applicants, I would say, if you're getting more than 50 to 100, it's probably worthwhile to have an applicant tracking system. I don't have a applicant tracking system that I recommend. My background's not really in HR. But there are, a few out there that, just do your research and see what kind of fits your goals. And the main thing with these ATS systems is it might come down to, okay, here's the features that I want, but here's the pricing, because they can get a little expensive depending on, if they're catering towards a Fortune 500 company or a small startup. So.
Fantastic. And those are really great suggestions to keep in mind when we design and when we think about how to organize our application processes or hiring processes. When we go now again one step further and we look into the interviews itself or themselves, what would you say, or what is your experience, are important aspects or topics to tackle during the interview, or questions to be asked? So would you say that there are some that you got or that you asked yourself that are really great questions to get behind or to understand that person better and their fit for the organization?
Yeah, so of course it's going to vary. If it's a technical role, you probably want somebody who has technical knowledge interviewing them. If it's a non-technical role, let's say it's a sales position, I think a lot of it's just going to be scenarios like, okay, let's say we're trying to close a deal and you're getting, these common objections. You can kind of do like a mock sort of back and forth. Like, let's say, you're trying to close somebody, but they just say they don't have the decision maker, their wife or their husband isn't there. They need to talk to them. What sort of process or mindset would you go through? So I love those, like having 2 or 3 situational questions in interviews where it's very targeted to the job you're hiring from. In this experience, if this goes wrong, what would you do? How would you react? And then that really will just tell you a lot about, how is it going to be working with this person, how their mind works. And you'll see, people who have experience, they'll have the right answers for this. And you'll clearly see that, okay, yeah, this is what we instruct our current employees to do. They kind of know the system and know what to do. If they don't have a good response, then they probably just don't have the right experience for that role. So those kind of really catered questions are always good for interviews. As far as other stuff, I don't think a lot of people put enough weight into kind of there's like the hard skills, which is very important, but there's also the soft skills. So just trying to like get to know the person a little bit more, like what are their hobbies? What do they like to do outside of work? Kind of figuring out what they do, like maybe what books they're reading, what stuff like that, just to kind of get a little bit more insight into the person that you're going to be potentially hiring. Because you're going to, if you're a small company, it can really change the culture if they're not a good fit for that company. And I've seen it, a bad hire ruin a remote work culture. So it's definitely possible. And you really have to make sure that, this person you're hiring is going to be a good fit. So.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I also do like that idea of getting more personal, but we also do know that there are people who just prefer not to share as much of personal stuff in the workplace, and also be sort of inclusive, not to overstep the boundaries that people might have, right? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I would say, of course, there's going to be some areas where they should be transparent about. Like if you're like offended by somebody asking you what books you're reading, then you're probably just not a good fit for a company like mine. If you're not transparent about that, so I think you have to be careful with the questions. You can't. There's some regulations and stuff in the U.S. that you have to abide by. But yeah, I think you're going to be wanting to work with people that you like and trust, right? So any way you can do that by having a nice conversation with them, not prying too deep, but just asking them questions that they should feel comfortable answering. There should be no reason. And again, a lot of it depends on the company culture you're trying to create. I've worked at big financial institutions where you're just essentially a number. There's not really any culture, and they're doing very well. But I've also worked at startups where there's really good culture, and a lot of that times the good culture is because they're hiring people who kind of fit that culture that they're wanting to create for that business or that brand.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting because Patricia is exactly saying here, underlining a little bit your comment, being comfortable remotely is crucial. Some people might even share more virtually than in person. And of course, expectations of the company and knowing its culture help determine the fit indeed. Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Patricia, for commenting and for letting us know your thoughts on this as well. Mike, I do believe that when we look now one step further, there are two aspects that we need to look into after having decided for a person. It's on one hand the global payroll, or how to manage a global payroll, and the second one is how to onboard. So whatever we want to look at first, those would be like my two last questions that I'd love to discuss with you.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. I was just reading about Upwork actually just launched a new platform. I'm forgetting the name, but essentially it's a platform where you can hire directly through, and you can essentially use this as a kind of a payroll or escrow company. So freelancers will feel safe there. Even remote workers might be a use case for this. But there's a lot of good software like QuickBooks and stuff to manage payroll. So QuickBooks, I believe the other one's Zoom or something, XOOM, I'm pretty sure. But QuickBooks is probably the most popular one that I've seen. And to manage payroll, if you have a big team, you probably want somebody dedicated to that who's going to be able to do that. Even when the head counts, around 10 or 15 people, it's probably good to have at least a part-time person doing this, because it can become very exhaustive when you have a whole remote team of people in 5 or 6 different countries, because there's different banks, there's different regulations. So I would say, yeah, get somebody to manage it, use a platform like QuickBooks. And then what was the other question?
But let me ask you here. So this is interesting, those two platforms that you were mentioning, and sort of managing it internally. What do you think about all those companies that are sort of there are so many companies on the market now that manage the payroll for you, even the whole hiring, right? In order to be able to hire globally, because a very small company might need a subsidiary in some country to hire somebody from there. If we're talking about fixed workers, and like Tilly Piper, Oyster, all those companies who take over the whole process for you, in what direction would you rather point us to look at?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of times, it's just going to come down to dollars and cents. Like, how much budget do you have to hire? I know a lot of startups, they just don't have a lot. So in that case, I would say, hey, you probably just want to do it yourself, do it in-house. Your first 10 or 15 hires are so crucial, because if you get a few bad ones, it'll really kind of mess up the foundation. Once you kind of reach that point of stability, you kind of know where your financial stuff's going to be at, then probably it's worthwhile to either hire somebody in-house to do it full time. But if that doesn't make sense for you, if you're not hiring somebody so consistently, then probably outsourcing to one of these companies. So I really, there's not one size fits all answer here. I think it's really going to depend on what your goals are, where you're at, and kind of where you want to be.
Absolutely. And last question would be, and I think this is like a crucial step, because we do know that fluctuation in the first 6 months depend a lot on the onboarding process. So question would be, how do you deal with the onboarding of remote workers in a remote company?
Yeah, it's a very great and important thing to do. I've had a lot of bad onboarding experiences at prior companies, and I've had a lot of good ones. So I've really seen how essential this is. And you'd be surprised, a lot of times, people put in their 2 weeks notice and they're just scrambling. So they don't have like an onboarding process really figured out. They're just like, hey, show up and we'll figure it out. Obviously, before anybody in your company is let go, you should be having them record SOPs, figuring out what their daily tasks are. And so this is going to make the onboarding process a lot easier because you already have those training materials created. So the best way to do that is, if you don't have this, make it a very important priority, no matter what size your company is. They need to have a job description. They need to have the task for what they're doing. And they also need to have SOPs for all those important tasks. And if you haven't done cross training between employees, I know that was like a big issue for our startup. And I couldn't take vacation for a couple of years because there was nobody else, cross trained to do if I were to go on vacation. So that's a very important thing. So the onboarding process needs to be very clearly outlined. Day one, here's the 5 things we want to accomplish, getting all the passwords for all the software set up. I love utilizing LastPass because it's an easy way to share all these passwords across an organization. Day 2, you're going to have everything kind of outlined. And the great thing is, when you're onboarding, you kind of want people to just get a feel about the whole organization. So I think in the first week, it doesn't have to be day 2, but they should be sitting down and just joining meetings, talking one-on-one to other employees, getting to know the other people they're going to be working with. Because at the end of the day, they're going to be more comfortable to ask questions, to give insight and feedback if they feel comfortable with their other coworkers. So that's something that, if they're working in marketing, they should be talking to the customer service team, the sales team, because there's just a lot of synergy that can happen between those departments. So yeah, definitely have the onboarding organized, have at least the first 3 to 4 weeks kind of outline, like what's the 2 to 3 big goals for each day? What's the big goal for each week? So, yeah, that's what I would say for onboarding. And then, yeah, you really need to have it like stuff on the calendar, start with the macro overview and then work into getting a little bit more specific.
Absolutely. Mike, it was fantastic. I, of course, could have you here for like 2 more hours, but we're keeping this short and concise to 30 minutes. And therefore, thank you very much. You gave us such a very detailed and yet broad overview about what hiring for remote workers means. And of course, please check out Mike's book, the Global Career Book webpage, where you as an individual can craft your global career fast and quick and learn from Mike's 100 plus countries, 380 cities experience, right?
Yeah, it keeps going. I'm excited to get back to traveling. And again, it's one of these things. Remote working just opens your world essentially. So it helps you build a more flexible life and allows you to travel and do things that you love.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mike, for being with us. You know that I have prepared a virtual cocktail backstage, and I'll meet you there in a bit. Thank you.
Take care. See you.
Thank you very much, Virtual Space Hero community. We got a few questions beforehand. I built them already into our conversation with Mike. And you know that we are going to be back on stage regularly Thursdays at 5:30. Next week, we're going to talk about how to craft virtually your career network. So stay tuned and check out our webpage, virtualspacehero.com, where you can find all the upcoming LinkedIn Lives. And with that, I say thank you very much for being with us. Thanks a lot for all your questions and your comments already beforehand when you're not able to join live. And I leave you with a wonderful morning, afternoon, or a good night. Bye.